If you loved cars in 1970s Britain, you knew the Jensen Interceptor, the hand-built Grand Tourer with a great curved wall of glass at the back, the car Princess Anne drove and Cliff Richard couldn't resist. It was built in West Bromwich by around 1,400 craftsmen, men who beat aluminium into shape by hand and trimmed the cabins in wood and leather. The firm had been born in the depths of the Depression. It survived a World War building military vehicles. It survived losing both the brothers whose name it carried, the loss of the contracts that had always fed it, and one change of owner after another. And then, after more than 40 years of making, the works off the Kelvin Way fell silent. How does a firm that survived all of that simply stop? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The car with the impossible window. There's a car that a great many people remember without ever knowing its name. They remember the shape of it. Low and wide Italian lines drawn over American muscle, and that back window. A great curved wall of glass wrapped around the tail like the canopy of a fighter aircraft. You could see clean through the thing. People called it the fishbowl. Nobody who ever saw one forgot it. Princess Anne owned one. That much is documented. Sir Cliff Richard bought himself a bright yellow one in the January of 1969, and years later, sitting in front of a television camera, he still lit up describing it. The impossible shape, the space-age glass, the sheer flamboyance of turning up somewhere in a car like that. Frank Sinatra was said to have kept several, all of them painted black. The comedian Eric Morecambe adored his. The car was called the Jensen Interceptor, and for a handful of glittering years, it was one of the most desirable objects a British firm had ever put its name to. It was built by hand in West Bromwich, by men who had learned their trade-beating aluminium panels over wooden formers. 7.2 litres of Chrysler V8 sat under the bonnet. The cabin was wood and leather, and the quiet confidence of something that cost more than a house. Around 6,400 of them left the works across a decade. Never many. There were never many, because Jensen was never a large company. It was a small firm that built expensive cars for people who could afford anything they liked. And then it was gone. Here is the part that refuses to sit neatly. The car that killed Jensen wasn't this one. It wasn't the big, thirsty, beautiful Interceptor at all. The thing that helped shove a proud old firm over the edge was an engine, a small 4-cylinder engine, under 2 litres, bought in a hurry to power a completely different car. A cheaper car. A car that most people have forgotten ever existed. That's the story. Not a tale of one glamorous machine, but of a firm that had survived the Depression, survived a world war, survived the loss of its own founders, and then bet everything it had left on a single motor car and a single unproven engine, just before the world changed underneath it. To understand how it ended, you have to start where it started, with 2 brothers from Birmingham and a battered little Austin 7. Chapter 2. 2 brothers and a chummy. The story begins, as so many of these stories do, with something small. Alan Jensen was born in Moseley, Birmingham, in 1906. His younger brother Richard, everyone called him Dick, followed 3 years later. Their father was a provisions importer of Danish descent, a comfortable enough middle-class household, and neither boy was destined by birth for the motor trade. What they had instead was an obsession. They loved cars at exactly the moment when loving cars still meant getting underneath them with your own hands. Alan served his apprenticeship at Cirque Radiators. Richard went to Wolseley Motors and later to Joseph Lucas, the great Birmingham electrical firm whose components would light and start half the cars in Britain. Between them, they were absorbing the 2 halves of an entire industry. Alan the structure and the shape of things, Richard the mechanical guts. And in the evenings and the weekends, around 1928, they built a car. It wasn't much to look at first, a tired 1923 Austin 7, a chummy, that cheerful little open tourer that put ordinary Britain on 4 wheels. The brothers stripped it and rebodied it with a low, rakish, boat-tailed shape that looked nothing like the humble thing underneath. They called it Jensen Special No. 1. And it worked. Not just mechanically. It turned heads. One of the heads it turned belonged to a man named Alfred Wilde of the Standard Motor Company, who liked the young man's eye for a line, enough to have Alan design a series of sporting 2-seaters. They were sold as the Standard Avon. 2 lads had bodged a special in a shed, and a proper manufacturer had noticed. What followed was a few restless years. A short spell at Patrick Motors in Birmingham, resigned directorships in 1931, and then the introduction that changed everything, arranged of all people by a grocer named George Mason, who knew a coach-building firm out at Carter's Green in West Bromwich that was struggling and needed men with ideas. The firm was W.J. Smith and Sons. It built commercial bodies, vans, lorries, the workaday metalwork of the West Midlands trades. It was not glamorous, it was a living. The brothers went in, and within 3 years they had taken the place over so completely that in 1934 they renamed it after themselves, Jensen Motors Limited. 2 men in their 20s, in the teeth of the Depression, putting their own name over the door of a coach builder that built other people's vehicles for a living. That last detail matters more than anything else in this chapter. Hold on to it. Because the very thing the Jensens did that first year, the thing that put them on the map, was building a body onto somebody else's chassis. In 1934, a commission arrived from Hollywood. The actor Clark Gable wanted a special-bodied car built onto a Ford V8 chassis. The Jensens built it. The following year came the White Lady, a sweeping great tourer that announced the little firm could dress a car as beautifully as anyone in Europe. The 2 brothers were not the same man twice over. Alan was the administrator, the pragmatist, the one who worried about where the money came from and where it went. Dick was the dreamer, the engineer whose mind ran to chassis and suspension and, one day, to a 4-wheel drive road car that nobody else in the world had built. Between them, they had the whole of a car company, the head and the heart. For 4 decades, that partnership held, but the shape of the business was set from that very first year. Jensen was a firm that survived by building other people's cars. It always had been. It was there in the bones of the place, in the men bent over the aluminium at Carter's Green, hammers rising and falling, shaping metal to a wooden buck. They were craftsmen. They were superb, and they were, from the beginning, dependent on the work that other bigger companies chose to send their way. For a long time, that dependence looked like strength. Chapter 3. Other People's Cars. After the war, after Jensen had spent it building military vehicles and components and come out the other side intact, the little firm found its most important friend, or rather, its most important customer. His name was Leonard Lord, and he ran Austin. The relationship that grew up between Austin and Jensen in those post-war years gave the West Bromwich firm something it had never really had, a steady, serious flow of work. Jensen built its own Austin-engined cars, the PW Saloon, and an early aluminium drophead that borrowed, of all names, the word Interceptor. But its own cars sold in tiny numbers. That was never where the survival came from. Then, in 1953, came a car that showed what Jensen could do when it built for itself, and got it right. The Jensen 541, designed by a quietly brilliant man named Eric Neal. It was shown at the London Motor Show that October, and it was extraordinary. One of the first European production cars with a body made of fiberglass, that strange new material that let a small firm mould a shape without the vast presses a steel body demanded. The deluxe version of 1956 was the first British 4-seater to have Dunlop disc brakes on all 4 wheels. The 541S was the first British car to offer seatbelts as standard. This was not a backward company. This was a firm punching a long way above its weight, and to house all this, Jensen built itself a proper home. Between 1954 and 1958, a new factory rose at Kelvin Way, West Bromwich, pulling 3 scattered sites together under one roof. It was built for volume. It was built for the lucrative work that was pouring in. Because by now the real Jensen business had arrived, and it wasn't Jensen's own cars at all. It was everyone else's. Walk onto the floor at Kelvin Way in the early 1960s, and you would not have thought you were in a firm that made grand tourers for the wealthy. You would have thought you were in a body plant. The air carried the tang of cellulose paint and the fine dust of sanded fiberglass, the sharp bite of lead loading and hot metal, and under it all the endless percussion of panel work, the flat, patient ring of a hammer finding a curve. Jensen was building body shells for the Austin Healey. First the 100, then the big, glorious 3000. Jensen made the shells. Final assembly happened down at the MG Works at Abingdon. 13,650 bodies in one run, late 1958 to 1961. 16,322 more between 1964 and 1968. These are enormous numbers for a firm this size. They were the numbers that kept the lights on. There was more. From 1961, Jensen assembled and finished the Volvo P1800, the sleek Swedish coupe that Roger Moore would drive as the Saint, familiar in every front room in Britain. The pressed steel shells came down from Linwood in Scotland. The contract was for 10,000 cars. And then there was the Sunbeam Tiger, developed and built for the Roots Group from 1964. A small British sports car with a thumping Ford V8 wedged into its nose. To make it fit, the story goes, men took a hammer to the firewall and simply beat out the room they needed. 7,085 Tigers were built at West Bromwich. Think about what that means. The Volvo that Roger Moore drove, the Austin Healey that a generation of Americans fell in love with. Jensen's hands were on more famous cars than its own. It was, in every sense that mattered, a contractor, a superbly skilled pair of hands that other companies hired to do the difficult, beautiful work they couldn't be bothered to do themselves. The trouble with living on other people's contracts is that they belong to other people. The first tremor came in 1963. Volvo, unhappy with the quality coming out of West Bromwich, pulled the P1800 back to Sweden after only around 6,000 cars, well short of the 10,000 promised. The head of Volvo, Gunnar Engelau, wanted the work at home. And just like that, a contract that was meant to run for years simply stopped. Nobody panicked. There was still the Healey work, still the Tiger, still plenty to do. The brothers were aging now, their health beginning to flag, and back in 1959 a group called Norcross, under a man named John Sheffield, had taken a stake to steady the ship. The firm felt solid. The order books were full. The men at Kelvin Way, some of whom had walked through those gates as boys back in the W.J. Smith days, had no reason to think their working lives were anything but secure, but a business that lives on contracts is only ever as safe as its next one, and the next few years were going to take the contracts away, all of them, very nearly at once. Chapter 4. The Italian and the Fishbowl. Before the fall, there was the summit, and the summit was glorious. The 541 had given way in 1962 to the CV8, a fiberglass Grand Tourer with a big Chrysler V8, fast and slightly ungainly, with a divisive front end that not everyone loved. And when the time came to replace it, Jensen tore itself in half deciding how. On one side stood the founders and Eric Neal, who wanted to keep faith with an in-house design. A steel notchback they called the P66, drawn and shaped by their own men in their own works. On the other stood the deputy chief engineer, a formidable figure named Kevin Beattie, and the managing director Brian Owen, who believed the future was Italian. Norcross chairman John Boex sided with Beattie and Owen. And so Beattie went to Italy, to the great coach builders, Ghia and Touring and Vignale, looking for a shape that would announce Jensen to the world. He found it at Touring, in a design by Federico Fomenti. Jensen bought it outright, stripped away Touring's markings, and had Vignale in Milan build the first bodies before production came home to West Bromwich. The result, in 1966, was the Interceptor. Those Italian lines, that wraparound glass, the unmistakable silhouette that Cliff Richard and Princess Anne and 100 others would fall for. It was a triumph, and it cost Jensen its founders. The decision to go Italian, to reject the family's own design, was more than Dick Jensen could stomach. That same year, 1966, Richard Jensen and Eric Neal left the company. Alan had already retired on grounds of health. The most famous car the firm ever built was not designed by the Jensens at all, and the choosing of it drove the last brother out the door of the company that bore his name. The Interceptor was only half the story of that year. Alongside it came something stranger and, in its way, more remarkable, the Jensen FF. The letters stood for Ferguson Formula, after Ferguson Research and the engineer Tony Rolt, and the FF was the first four-wheel drive production passenger car in the world, fitted with anti-lock brakes borrowed from aircraft, a Dunlop system called Maxaret. Sit with that. A small firm in West Bromwich, building perhaps a few hundred cars a year, beat the entire global motor industry to four-wheel drive with anti-lock brakes. It preceded the Audi Quattro, the car that would take all the credit, by the better part of 15 years. The Quattro didn't even get anti-lock brakes until 1984, 18 years after the FF had them. The FF was Dick Jensen's dream made metal, and Alan had thought it commercially pointless, and Alan was right. Only 320 were built, hobbled by the fact that its mechanicals only ever allowed right-hand drive, which shut it out of America. It made almost no money, but it was magnificent. Britain invented the thing the world would later decide it couldn't live without, and then let it slip away. Step onto the Kelvin Way floor at the height of the Interceptor years, and you would have understood, immediately, why these cars cost what they cost. This was not a production line in the Longbridge sense, no great automated river of steel. This was assembly by people, bodies arriving at first from Milan, the deep smell of hide from the trim shop, where seats were cut and stitched and fitted by hand, the particular hush of the paint booths and the patient men who wet-sanded between coats until a bonnet looked like still water, walnut veneer cut and matched for the dashboards, and out on the road behind the works, the sound that told you a car was finished, the low, round, unhurried burble of a big American V8 warming through, filling the West Bromwich air with a noise that had no business coming out of a factory this modest. The men who did this work were not interchangeable. Some had been there since the 1920s, since before the brothers had even arrived. They had spent their whole lives learning how metal wanted to move under a hammer, how to make a panel gap disappear, how to make a hand-built car feel as though it had been carved from a single block. It was skill of a kind that takes a lifetime to acquire and an afternoon to make redundant. And for a while, the money came. Under a bracing new managing director named Carl Duer, output climbed. 506 cars in 1968, 644 the year after. Then, in 1972, the summit itself, a record pre-tax profit of £200,000, £682. Celebrities queued for hand-built Interceptors. The order book was healthy. The name meant something. Standing on that peak in that record year, with royalty and film stars driving your cars, and a profit on the books, you would have been forgiven for thinking the little firm from Carter's Green had finally, permanently arrived. But the contracts had already gone, and nobody outside the boardroom yet understood what that was going to mean. Chapter 5. The Big Hole. The glamour of the Interceptor concealed a wound that had opened years before the record profit was ever counted. 1967 was the year the floor gave way. 2 contracts ended almost together. Chrysler took control of the Roots Group and killed the Ford-engined Sunbeam Tiger. It would not build a car powered by a rival's V8, and the last Tiger left West Bromwich on the 27th of June that year. At almost the same moment, the Austin Healey bodywork wound down. The consultancy that had underpinned so much of the firm's volume simply stopped. Years later, the sales and marketing director Richard Graves described what that felt like on the ground, and his words are worth hearing plainly. The ending of the Healey and the Tiger, he said, saw the workforce collapse from around 1,200 to 400. Everything went in one go. There was, he said, a big hole. A big hole. Not a downturn, not a dip. A hole where 2/3 of the work used to be. The company posted a loss of £52,000 in 1967. The lights still burned at Kelvin Way, and the Interceptor still rolled out the door in its small numbers. But the thing that had actually paid the wages for decades, the business of building other companies' cars, had vanished in a single year. And there is only so long a firm can survive on a few hundred hand-built luxury cars a year when the contract work that subsidized it has evaporated. Norcross brought in the man to fix it. Carl Duer arrived as managing director in 1968. Chicago-born, Austria-based, a former Marshall Plan industry man and sometime actor, the kind of restless, self-invented character who gets called a turnaround specialist. He steadied things and he sold Jensen on to the merchant bank William Brandt. But steadying was not the same as solving. The fundamental problem remained. Jensen had a factory built for volume, a workforce gutted to a fraction of its old size, and nothing to fill the space where the contracts had been. What it needed was a car of its own that sold in real numbers. Not a few hundred Interceptors, thousands, tens of thousands. A volume car to replace the volume work. And here, from an unexpected direction, came both a rescue and a trap. His name was Kjell Kvale, Norwegian-American, San Francisco-based, one of the largest importers of British cars in the world through his firm British Motorcar Distributors. Kvale had made a great deal of money selling Austin Healeys to Americans, and when the Healey died, he lost his single most profitable line. He wanted a replacement. He learned that the men who had actually built the Healey's body were sitting in West Bromwich with an empty factory. And in 1970, Cavalli bought control of Jensen. He moved fast. He installed Alfred Vickers, formerly of Rolls-Royce, as managing director. He made the great Donald Healey himself chairman and brought in Healey's son Geoffrey on design. He forced Carl Duer out, and he set the company a single, enormous objective: build a new, affordable sports car, a Jensen Healey, and sell it to America by the thousand. 10,000 a year was the dream. It was the number that would fill the hole. This was not vanity. This is the part the simple version of the story always misses. The Jensen Healey was not a rich man's indulgence. It was a structural necessity, a desperate, logical attempt to replace the contract revenue that had kept the firm alive since the 1930s. The workforce had already been cut to the bone once. The factory was half empty. Jensen had to have a volume car, and it had to have it soon. So the whole future of the company was gathered up and placed onto one bet. One new car, one new market, one roll of the dice to replace everything that had been lost. There was only one thing missing. The car needed an engine, and the choosing of that engine, the single decision at the dark heart of this entire story, was about to be made. Chapter 6. The Handshake with the Devil. Every engineer at Jensen knew that the new car lived or died on the engine. The search began in earnest at the turn of the decade, and it was not for want of options that it ended where it did. Donald Healey wanted the Vauxhall Slant 4, light, economical, cheap, around £160 a unit. But in the emissions-strangled tune America now demanded, it met the rules and missed the power target, making nothing like the 130 horsepower the car was designed around. Ford offered a way out: a 2-litre Pinto engine, a German V6, even a complete Cortina platform to build on. But the German V6 was throttled by industrial action that crippled its supply, and the packaging never quite worked. Then there was BMW, the proven, sweet, reliable 4-cylinder engine from the BMW 2002, a known quantity, an engine that simply worked. Jensen wanted it so badly that a group of engineers under Brian Spicer did something close to industrial espionage. They rented a BMW 2002, quietly pulled its engine out, fitted it to a Jensen Healey to see how it drove, and then put the car back together and returned it as though nothing had happened. It drove beautifully. It was exactly what the company needed. And on the 21st of June, 1971, BMW wrote to say it could not supply the 10,000 engines a year that Jensen required. The one engine everyone trusted was lost, not on merit, but on volume. The way the alternative arrived is almost too neat to be true, and yet the record insists on it. 2 Jensen technicians talking over their engine troubles on a train were overheard by a man named Graham Arnold, who happened to work for Lotus. Word travelled, and soon Colin Chapman, the mercurial genius behind Lotus, was offering Jensen his brand new engine. It was called the Type 907, and on paper it was a marvel. A 2-litre, all-alloy, 16-valve, twin overhead cam slant 4, the first modern engine of its kind to go down a mass-production assembly line, around 144 horsepower, crowned with a then-novel toothed rubber belt to drive its camshafts. It was everything the Vauxhall wasn't. It was glamorous. It carried the Lotus name, and it had never been fitted to a production car in its life. Colin Chapman was, by every account, one of the hardest and cleverest negotiators the British motor industry ever produced, and he read Cavalli completely. The terms Jensen agreed to were the terms of a company that wanted the deal too much to see straight. Jensen would buy the engines at £300 each, already well over the budget the whole project had been costed around, and Jensen would buy them with no warranty. None. Every engine that failed, and this was an engine that had, in Chapman's own workshops, not yet finished being developed, would be Jensen's problem to fix, at Jensen's expense. When the terms came back to West Bromwich, the reaction in management was disbelief. Chapman had outnegotiated them entirely. The engineers knew what they were being handed. The deputy engineer Mike Jones would say, long afterwards, that he still could not believe they signed the engine off for production when it was so clearly nowhere near ready, and that he sensed Cavalli had simply overruled the engineering team's fears. Kevin Beatty signed, Howard Panton signed, Brian Spicer signed. Men who knew better put their names to it because the man who owned the company had decided, and the car had to have an engine, and this was the engine there was. At the London Motor Show at Earl's Court, the 907 sat gleaming on its display stand, polished and perfect and still. A beautiful thing to look at. Behind the scenes, the men who understood engines had already begun to feel the ground move. Chapter 7. Developed by its owners. The Jensen Healey was unveiled at Geneva in March of 1972, and the first reviews were warm. Here, at last, was the volume car, a pretty, quick, open two-seater, priced to sell, aimed squarely at the Americans who had loved the old Healey. For a few months, it looked as though the bet might pay. Then the cars reached customers, and the tide turned. The engine drank oil. It drank it at a rate that alarmed owners and embarrassed dealers. The rubber cam belt, that clever, modern touch, could slip or jump its timing, and when a belt lets go on an engine like this, the valves and pistons meet, and the engine is finished. On downhill runs, fuel leaked and flooded from the Italian Dell'Orto carburetors. Under hard cornering and braking, oil surged and was pulled out through the breather. At startup, the oil pressure came up too slowly. It was not one fault. It was a laundry list of faults, and every one of them landed on a customer who had paid good money for a Jensen. The root of much of it lay in the way oil gathered around the valve gear and drained back too slowly, and in the sealing of the cam towers, and in the discipline required to change that belt on time. Discipline that owners, reasonably, did not know they needed. These were the problems of an engine that had been sent to market before it was finished, and Jensen was now finishing it. Not in a laboratory. On the customers' cars, one warranty claim at a time. The men from West Bromwich all but moved in with Lotus. A constant stream of Jensen staff shuttled to Colin Chapman's factory at Hethel, out on a Norfolk airfield. Kevin Beattie, Mike Jones, a quality man named Andrew B. Jensen even planted a man on site, Philip Campion, whose job was effectively to spy on Lotus's output and report back twice a day how many engines were actually being built. Because they often weren't. Lotus overpromised engines and underdelivered them, and the sales director Richard Graves would confront Lotus's Dennis Austin over engine assembly halls that stood conspicuously empty. And there was a deeper cruelty in the arrangement. When Lotus worked out how to fix a fault, it treated the fix as its own intellectual property, kept it secret, and then charged Jensen for the improvement. Alfred Vickers grew visibly animated over price rises he had no power to refuse, because Jensen had no alternative supplier. There was no other engine. There was no other deal. Chapman had built himself a customer who could not walk away, and he priced accordingly. The engineering, at least, was not for want of effort. Mike Jones and a legislation engineer named John Linley took two cars, each run in for 4,000 miles, out to the Environmental Protection Agency at Ann Arbor, Michigan, and won the American certification the whole American dream depended on. Lower compression, different carburetors, a heated manifold, a catalytic converter. The improved Mark II of 1974 was, by every measure, a far better car than the one that launched. But by then, it was too late. The reputation had set like concrete. The press had already coined the epitaph, and it was devastating precisely because it was fair. Body by Jensen, engine by Lotus, development by owner. The joke went round that the most reliable thing about a Jensen Healey was its unreliability. Every one of those repairs came out of Jensen's own pocket because of a clause signed at Earl's Court that meant the company owned every failure. And behind the engine bill sat another, quieter drain, the costly F-type and G-type projects Cavalli had set in motion, an estimated £1.5 to £2 million pouring into the future, while the present bled out through 1,000 warranty claims. The volume car built to save the company was, slowly and expensively, helping to sink it. But it was only the small car. The big car, the beautiful one, the profitable one, the Interceptor that Sinatra and royalty drove, was still selling. That was where the money still came from. And in October of 1973, the money stopped. Chapter 8. 11 miles to the gallon. The Interceptor was the breadwinner. It always had been. A 7.2-litre V8 Grand Tourer, hand-built, expensive, and profitable in a way the little Healey never managed to be. It also returned, by the measured figures of the day, around 11 miles to the gallon. For most of the Interceptor's life, nobody who could afford one cared what it drank. That was rather the point of it. Then, in October 1973, war in the Middle East brought an oil embargo, and the price of petrol soared, and rationing was threatened, and a 50-mile-an-hour limit came down on British roads, and a car that drank a gallon every 11 miles stopped being a symbol of success and became, overnight, a symbol of something you could no longer justify. Demand for big, thirsty Grand Tourers was very nearly killed off in a matter of weeks. The revised Interceptor of 1973 and the convertible that followed were hurt badly, not by any fault of their own, but by a world that had abruptly decided it could not afford them. Look at what happened to the numbers, and the speed of it takes the breath away. The record profit of 1972, £200,000. In 1973, pre-tax profit collapsed to around £10,000. In 1974, a loss of £120,000. The list price of an Interceptor, meanwhile, was climbing with the inflation of the age from just under £7,000 in the August of 1973 towards £10,700 by early 1976. The car getting more expensive exactly as the willingness to buy it drained away. The workforce, which had recovered to around 1,400 at the peak, was cut in half, down to 700, through retirements and redundancies as the firm scrambled to stop the bleeding, and the mood on the floor curdled. The 3-day week, imposed across Britain in the January of 1974, fed a wider industrial bitterness, and there was a feeling in some quarters that the rich American owner was a man who could be squeezed. Trust, inside those walls, was wearing through. There is a bitter irony buried in the timing, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The engine, the 907, the villain of the popular story, had wounded a peripheral car, the small Healey that never sold in the numbers hoped for. The oil crisis gutted the breadwinner, the Interceptor, the car that actually paid the bills. If you are looking for the single blow that did the most financial damage, it was not the engine at all. It was the embargo and what it did to demand for the big V8. And here the story turns cruel in a way no scriptwriter would dare invent. By 1975, the luxury market had steadied and begun to come back. Richard Graves found he could not keep up with the demand for Interceptors and for the little GT. One dealer in Bahrain, a man named K.R. Zayani, had started in the December of 1973, of all the moments, selling Interceptors to the oil-rich buyers of the Gulf, the very people the embargo had enriched. The orders were there again. The market Jensen had bet on had come roaring back. It had simply come back too late, because by the time it did, the company was already tangled in union troubles and supplier distrust, and a balance sheet soaked in warranty claims, and it no longer had the strength to reach out and take the orders that were finally, agonizingly, there for the taking. Chapter 9. The Receiver at the Gate. 1975 is the year the story stops being about cars. It opened with mass redundancies, another round of men let go to cut what it cost to keep the doors open, and it kept getting heavier from there. Kevin Beattie was the engineer who had driven the whole Italian gamble that gave the world the Interceptor. He had toured the coach builders. He had chosen Touring's shape. He had also shouldered the Lotus disaster, signed the engine off, and then spent years running to Hethel trying to fix what could not easily be fixed. In September of 1975, within days of the end coming, Kevin Beattie died. The strain of it sits behind that plain fact, unspoken and unmistakable. The end came formally on the 15th of September, 1975. A receiver was appointed. His name was John A. Griffiths. His representative on site, a man named Michael Williams, stood in front of a television camera for the regional news a week later and was asked, in effect, how much longer the company could go on functioning at all. That is the whole distance of it. From royalty in the driving seat to a receiver's man on the local news, fielding questions about how many weeks were left. The receiver kept a little production going, a revised late-series Interceptor, a new notchback coupe, its assembly farmed out to Panther cars. And the Jensen GT, Cavalle's idea for a smaller, thriftier Jensen, a neat little shooting brake, launched at Earl's Court in the October of 1975 into a company that was already in receivership. Only 511 were built. It sold at a loss. When Autocar tested it, the magazine noted openly that bankruptcy looked highly likely, which is not a line that sells a motor car, and it cost around $10,000 in America against $3,500 for an MGB GT. It never had a chance. Donald Healey was already gone. He had stepped down as chairman back in 1973. dismayed at what was happening to the car that carried his name. Later, he would try to buy Jensen's assets from the receiver, but he would have needed something like £1.5 million, and the government refused to help him. The same government that would, a few years on, pour money into the DeLorean venture in Belfast looked at Jensen, a firm with 40 years of history and a workforce of skilled men, and declined. Production finally ended in May of 1976. The receiver gave up trying to sell Jensen as a living concern and began instead to sell it for parts. The collapse cost around 700 jobs, 2/3 of the workforce. Skilled men, some of whom had walked through the Carter's Green gates as boys in the 1920s, back in the W.J. Smith days, and had never worked anywhere else. Men who could make a panel gap vanish and a hand-built car feel carved from a single billet. They were turned out into a West Midlands that was already shedding industrial jobs by the thousand, into a Britain where the work they knew how to do was quietly ceasing to exist. A small firm formed out of the wreckage, Jensen Parts and Service, under Kevin Edmiston and Ian Orford, to finish off the last few high-value Interceptors from the stock of engines and parts that remained, until those ran out too. And then the lines at Kelvin Way went quiet. A factory built for the sound of hammers and V8s and men calling to one another across the floor, holding nothing but still air. Chapter 10. Jensen House. The name never quite died. That is almost the saddest part. It flickered. Jensen Parts and Service kept the flame through the lean years, servicing the cars, holding the name in trust, and every so often, someone tried to light it properly again. From 1998, a new operation at Speke, on Merseyside, built a roadster called the Jensen SV8. The first year's 400 cars were reportedly pre-sold. It should have worked, but the suppliers behind it collapsed around the turn of the millennium, and the venture failed by 2002, and only a fraction of those promised cars were ever built. Later, the rights drifted to Switzerland. In 2011, there was an announcement of a new Interceptor to be built at Browns Lane in Coventry. It never materialised. That same year, on the 30th of July, the original legal entity, the company two brothers had named after themselves in 1934, was quietly dissolved. The founders had gone long before. Richard Jensen, Dick, the dreamer, the man who had wanted four-wheel drive when the world thought it pointless, died in London in September 1977, barely a year after the factory that bore his name fell silent. Alan Jensen, the pragmatist, the administrator, the elder brother who had kept the books, lived on much longer and died in Brighton in 1994. Today there is a firm in Oxfordshire, Jensen International Automotive, that takes original Interceptors and rebuilds them, re-engineered, modernised, made to run as they perhaps always should have. It is a loving thing, but it is a restoration business, an afterlife, not a revival. Nobody builds a new Jensen. Nobody has for a long time. Go to West Bromwich now, and the works is still there, in a fashion. The Kelvin Way site survives, carved up into small units, the Kelvin Way trading estate, a scatter of little businesses in a place built to hold one great one. The original offices at Carter's Green still stand too, renamed Jensen House, put to use over the years as council offices. There is no grand memorial. The heritage is kept alive chiefly by the people who loved the cars. The Owners Club, an online museum, a local history society that records, quietly, that Jensen was the most internationally famous company the town ever produced, and also one of its shortest lived. It survived barely 50 years. Set the two pictures side by side. 1,400 craftsmen at the peak, hand-building cars for Frank Sinatra and a princess, beating aluminium into shapes that turned heads across 2 continents, and a quiet trading estate off a West Bromwich road, and an old office block wearing the family name over a door that leads now to something else entirely. So what killed Jensen? Not one engine. That is the story people tell, and it is not wrong so much as it is incomplete. The Lotus 907 was real, and its failures were real, and the mad decision to buy it untested and without warranty was a wound the company inflicted on itself and then paid for, over and over, out of a pocket that was already emptying. The engine broke the small car, but the engine did not, on its own, break the firm. What broke the firm was older and deeper than that. Jensen had lived, from its very first year, on other people's work. The Gable Commission, the Austin Healey Shells, the Volvos, the Tigers. When those contracts vanished in the late 1960s, The business model that had carried the firm for 30 years vanished with them, and the workforce was gutted before the Healey gamble even began. So Jensen bet everything it had left on one car of its own, to fill the hole the contracts left behind, and it chose, to power that car, an engine that was not ready. And then, before the bet could possibly pay off, an oil crisis on the far side of the world killed the appetite for the big V8 that was keeping the whole enterprise afloat. The lost contracts were the disease. The engine was the vivid, visible symptom. The oil crisis was the blow that finished it, and the cruelest detail of all is that the market came back strong in 1975, and found Jensen already on the floor, too weak to stand and answer it. The legacy outlived the company, in its way. Every all-wheel drive performance car on the road today is a distant echo of the FF, the little miracle from West Bromwich that got there first and got none of the credit. The 16-valve twin-cam engine that ruined the Jensen Healey pointed, painfully, straight at the multi-valve engines that would one day power nearly everything. And the Interceptor, the beautiful car with the impossible window, is sought after again, appreciating, cherished, worth more now to collectors than it ever earned for the men who built it. Those men are mostly gone. The skill in their hands went with them, and the works where they spent their lives stands quiet off the Kelvin Way, wearing another purpose, while the name that meant Sinatra and princesses and a great curved wall of glass sits over an office door, waiting for people who remember to walk past and, just for a moment, recall what it once was.